most of the times we see Microsoft 365 operations, but we also saw them harvesting Gmail credentials and Yahoo credentials. And in doing so, they obfuscate their identity. They use disposable or anonymized infrastructure, VPN connections, and they start pilfering through all data of interest in that environment, the cloud environment, whether it's OneDrive or email, and they look for very specific data related to Iran and other foreign affairs issues that might be of interest.
Welcome to another episode of Mandiant's Defender's Advantage podcast. I'm your host, Luke McNamara. Joining me today, I have the pleasure of welcoming on Ofir Rozmann, an APT researcher here at Mandiant Intel. Ofir, great to have you here this morning.
Hi, Luke. Good morning, and very happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So the backstory to why we're doing this particular episode, which is sort of an update around Iranian threat activity, is I think when you look at certainly some of the podcasts that we have done on this show, if you look at some of the blogs that Mandiant has put out over the last year, we've put out an overwhelming amount, I think, on a lot of Chinese threat activity, North Korean threat activity, and Russian threat activity. With a few notable examples, such as the tool of first resort paper, we haven't discussed as much around Iranian threat activity. And I think, looking at the situation in the Middle East, and God forbid we get an escalation of that conflict, I think there's a lot of questions as to what we've been seeing in terms of Iranian threat activity, both with respect to cyber espionage, but also cyber attack and some of the other hack and leak type operations, how that could potentially escalate. So this is sort of an episode to kind of dive deeper into what's been going on and then where things might lead. And I'll start off here. I mean, as I mentioned, I'll reference that paper, The Tool of First Resort. This was a joint analytic product between Mandiant and our colleagues here at Google, the threat analysis group TAG. This came out back in February. We'll include a link in the show notes. Some of the key findings in that report was that we continue to see Iran very aggressively target Israeli and U.S. entities, certainly in the lead up to the conflict. There were some operations that we saw against Iranian critical infrastructure. And then I think we saw sort of a typical pattern of Hamas-related cyber espionage activity in the lead up to October 7th, but nothing kind of significant since then. So those are sort of like the key points of that report. But I'm curious from your perspective, maybe just touch on the wave tops as we get into the specific activity, but wave tops of cyber threat activity, particularly from Iran, that we have seen since February, since we put out that report.
Yeah, so since February and even since the October 7 attack on Israel, what we've observed is basically you can picture it as an overt layer of operations, and way underneath is a covert a layer of operation. The overt layer would be the hack and leak operations conducted by many Iranian threat actors, both from the two top organizations conducting cyber operations in Iran, which are MOIS, the Ministry of Intelligence and Security, and the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And these operations, these hack and leak operations, they take most of the focus and coverage. They make the most noise. They are the ones that are more prominent in terms of social media coverage and journalism. Underneath this very noisy layer, what we're still seeing is very extensive cyber collection efforts. These were, of course, existed even before October 2023, but we still see them to this day. And these are conducted both by MOIS and IRGC, and they are targeting an extensive variety of sectors and countries, both in the Middle East and worldwide, and of course in Israel. When we're looking at these operations, even though they are very different from each other, we do see some common ground, some common characteristics between them. First of all of them are aimed at data exfiltration. whether it's for to support decision making or to support military efforts. All of them are also relying as much as possible on publicly available resources and implants, which is something that Iran is very much known for, the living of the land strategy. All of them, interestingly, or almost all of them, abuse cloud infrastructure and use anonymization infrastructure. This is to avoid detection by network defenders, SOC operators, and even security researchers like us.
So I think there's a couple of interesting things that you said there. One, I think the presence of the hack and leak activity, that's been interesting to kind of see. I think to your point, sometimes that does get more attention because of its very overt and public nature. I think there's also an aspect to where we should consider some of that to be almost kind of in the information operations space, right? Where we see threat actors claiming, in some cases, maybe greater success than they actually achieved. So there's a very important, I think, kind of messaging component that you often see with operations like this. It's also interesting what you noted about the data exfiltration piece. Without drawing, I think we have to avoid drawing too many comparisons to the cyber aspect of the conflict in Ukraine and what we've seen over the last several years from Russian threat actors. But it's interesting in that context to see threat actors shift sometimes from prioritizing, and of course this also varies amongst the particular groups, but prioritizing maybe data theft and espionage, and then at times kind of shifting to more destructive cyber attacks, employing wiper malware and things like this. It sounds like what you're saying for most of those APTs and UNCs that we track associated with Iran, we've seen to date mostly espionage and data theft. Would that be a fair
We do
characterization?
still see some disruptive and even destructive activities, but yes, the majority of the groups we currently track are very much dedicated to data exfiltration.
And before we get into talking about some of the specific groups, just again, broadly and generally speaking, in terms of the targeting, what we see prior to October 7th versus what we've seen since then, is this largely a lot of the same, same kind of targets that we've seen over the years from Iranian threat actors?
The answer is a bit complex, so it's a yes and no, because yes, in terms of Iran is still interested in what Iran was interested in. For example, the IRGC campaigns that we've been looking at are definitely interested in the same, let's say, sectors they were interested in, whether it's defense, government, aviation, tech industries. So this is definitely something that we're still seeing even after October. But what we do see is that the threat actors, in terms of their social engineering schemes, are abusing the war and using themes and topics related to the war to disseminate their backdoors or to harvest credentials as part of phishing campaigns. And this is something we're going to dive into a bit when we talk about specific actors later, but this is a trend that we've seen in more than one threat actor, so it's pretty interesting.
Well, that's a great segue. I mean, you mentioned credential harvesting. Maybe the first actor we can dive into, APT42. This is a threat actor, I think probably the most recently, yeah, it is the most recently graduated Iranian APT, and a threat actor that has over the years, amongst a variety of different TTPs and tactics, employed credential harvesting as part of their operation. So maybe we can dive first into APT42 and what they've been up to.
Yeah, sounds good. So APT42 is this name basically describes an umbrella of multiple subgroups within the RGC intelligence organization. All of them can be clustered to the same group based on TTPs, based on their themes, their targeting, but they have slight variations. Now, this group was affiliated with the RGC intelligence organization, and this organization is in charge of countering internal and external threats to the Iranian regime. And accordingly, APT42 targeting very much matches this purpose and supports that by collecting as much data as it can from basically anyone that has access to sensitive information of strategic interest to the Iranian regime. This includes high-profile individuals and organizations that could be affiliated with journalism, with human rights activism, ex-security personnel, academia and research personnel, specifically ones that are conducting research related to Iran. And we've also seen them targeting NGOs and legal sectors. So basically, all across the board, anyone who possesses interesting data. Now, what APT42 does is usually start with a phishing campaign. This phishing campaign, while it's not very sophisticated in terms of the technique or the tools that they use, the sophistication lies in the social engineering operation. APT42 are masters of creating fake identities or masquerading as legitimate entities, and they use the infrastructure that they set up to masquerade as these entities to conduct ongoing correspondence with its targets, sometimes lasting several weeks, without delivering any implant or malicious content. This includes sending well-crafted conference and meeting invitations, talking with their victims, and only then, when they gain the victim's trust, they harvest the credentials or deliver a unique backdoor. Now, after they obtained the victim's credentials, that's when it gets interesting in terms of what they do technologically. Because what APT42 has been known in doing is log in to the victim's cloud environment. Most of the times we see Microsoft 365 operations, but we also saw them harvesting Gmail credentials and Yahoo credentials. And in doing so, they obfuscate their identity. They use disposable or anonymized infrastructure, VPN connections, and they start pilfering through all data of interest in that environment, the cloud environment, whether it's OneDrive or email, and they look for very specific data related to Iran and other foreign affairs issues that might be of interest. Now, when they walk through the victim environment, they do that almost exclusively without dedicated infrastructure and implants. So this makes the operation pretty hard to detect, especially due to the focus on cloud environments, which by themselves are often poorly monitored when compared to, for example, on-prem environments. This is exactly what APT42 wants. They want to target the weak environments. They want to bypass multi-factor authentication if one exists at all, and steal the victim's emails, steal their sensitive documents, and gain very sensitive intelligence to support IRGC operations. What we're still seeing is APT42 setting up infrastructure, and we've actually seen this happening even after our publication on them. We published about them almost 2 months ago, I believe. But even after that, we still see them setting up infrastructure and renewing their operations. So we're talking about very extensive and relatively resilient operations.
I think they're a good example, and we talked about this a little bit when we did an episode around the APT42 graduation, but I think they're a very good example of what you see from a number of other related Iranian, clusters, which is like to your point, a very good understanding of how to go about targeting the entities and individuals they go after in a patience with the social engineering. And I think sometimes you see a threat actor where maybe like 42, where a bulk of the work is just simple, credential harvesting. And maybe it seems comparatively unsophisticated in a lot of ways, but I think it's a good example of how effective an adversary can be if they are just incredibly good at understanding and engaging with their target through social engineering.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And the social engineering and the proficiency in navigating throughout cloud environments makes sophisticated methods and the strategic implants, it makes their utilization obsolete. And it's very smart on behalf of the operators, because In that case, it makes the entire operation more resilient for publications, or for anyone that wants to defend against this activity or to research it.
Yeah, so let's talk about another threat actor that actually has some historical overlap in connection to APT42. This is another suspected IRGC group, APT35. And I know that you've been doing some research around some particular kind of subgroups with respect to this. So, what have we been seeing with sort of APT35 associated activity of late?
Yeah, so APT35 is another very good example of IRGC continuing to conduct operations even this time. And what we've been seeing from them is significantly different from APT42, even though the two APTs do share historic connections, like you mentioned. But we haven't seen any connections between in a while now, so we believe they are different. They are operated by different sub organizations under IRGC, and we believe that APT35 is more affiliated with IRGC's electronic warfare and cyber defense organization, named EWECD. Now, we've been tracking two subclusters under APT35. The first one, we call them ANC3890, and it's known publicly as Imperial Kitten. And what we've been seeing from these guys is that they use extensive phishing and watering hole efforts. They are targeting shipping, government, and many other sectors. Specifically, we observed ANC3890 hacking into multiple logistics and shipping companies' websites, and they planted watering holes in these websites. This was a likely attempt to harvest credentials and gain further access to users of these websites. And after they gained the email credentials and the login credentials, these may be leveraged for further access and to support intelligence needs. And when we're talking about sensitive shipping companies sending away sensitive cargo, this may be even used to conduct or support kinetic operations by the IRGC as part of the maritime warfare between IRGC and many countries, including US, Israel, UK, that's been going on for several years now.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, without getting too far into kind of the speculation of how that information collection is being utilized, certainly we're kind of in a time where you see a greater focus in the region around maritime security with some of the attacks on shipping and that. So this is certainly a sector of interest, I think, to Iran and something we've been seeing actually for some time, to your point, even beyond the last, several months.
Absolutely. And again, not jumping into conclusions, like you said.
So you mentioned that was
um,
the first cluster. What was the other cluster that we're tracking associated with 35?
yeah, so the second cluster is we believe it is linked to what was previously known as tortoise shell. We call them ANC 1549, and these guys are, you could say, a bit more technologically advanced actor. What we've been seeing from these guys, they are targeting aviation and defense industries, mostly in Israel, UAE, and to some extent other Middle Eastern countries, and possibly even Albania. We've seen some infrastructure that seem to be dedicated to targeting Albania. And what's interesting about these guys is that they have been abusing Azure infrastructure to a large in an to an extent that we haven't seen before by any other Iranian actor. And specifically, we've seen more than 120 Azure subdomains set up by these guys, intended both to conduct C2 communications with their implants. Now, the in addition to using cloud infrastructure, what we've also observed from these guys is extensive social engineering and phishing operations to deliver their backdoors. What we've publicly named Minibike and Minibus to various technological organizations, both aviation and defense, as I mentioned. And the the thing about these guys is when they use these backdoors, the almost all of the C2 infrastructure that we observed was based on Azure, the Microsoft Azure infrastructure. And specifically, they've been using subdomains with names that masqueraded as legitimate entities and services. So this overall might make it a bit difficult for network defenders to detect. And we've published a long list of their infrastructure as well as their hashes and more information about how to detect these guys for anyone that wants to protect itself, because these guys are very aggressive and a bit more technologically advanced, as I mentioned. And we mentioned earlier the changes that Iranian actors did after the October 7 attack on Israel. And this one is a good example because ANC 1549, we've seen them, if we've seen them before masquerading as aviation companies, after October 7, we've seen them masquerading as the Israeli Bring Them Home Now movement. This is the movement calling to the return of the hostages kidnapped by Hamas on October 7. And specifically, they set up a fake website masquerading as this movement, and even set up a fake application through which they delivered their backdoor, the minibus backdoor. And anyone who downloaded and installed that application basically had a ANC 1549 backdoor on their device. And this, we believe, this way they gained access to entities, mostly in Israel, but possibly even in other places around the world.
So again, maybe another comparison I would draw to the cyber aspect of the conflict in Ukraine is sort of the leveraging of events or things of public interest around the conflict itself to carry out follow-on, social engineering and phishing operations and things of that nature. One question I want to ask you about the targeting of aviation and defense. I mean, that's always been, I think, a particular area of focus for APT35, even going back to, the newscaster era of operations that we saw from them, which had also pretty big overlaps, I think, with some of the 42 stuff. But the targeting of aviation entities and aviation and defense in the case of APT35 and related clusters, do you see that as being very similar to when we see other aspects of aviation? And I'm thinking more of like airlines, travel companies that we've also seen historically get targeted by Iranian threat actors, groups like APT39, I believe, that also will carry out operations that seem to be more focused on the sort of tracking of individuals, going after high value targets, going after entities, for example, that are involved in like border control in certain countries, or they'll even going after the hospitality industry. To me, that's always seemed a little bit different, right? The targeting of aerospace and defense versus the targeting of airlines and other hotels for tracking individuals. Do you think that there's kind of an overlap there, or do you see this as somewhat distinct missions?
Without going too much into the specific victims we've observed, but I can say that in the case of ANC 1549, we've seen them targeting aviation sector for likely for both purposes. One would be a technological interest in the technologies developed by the aviation company, and another aviation related entity. It was we don't know if the operation there was successful, but the targeting was more likely related to what you said, tracking specific individuals of interest to Iran, and more related to PII rather than intellectual property.
So I guess with that note, shifting gears a little bit, let's talk about Temp.Zagros, right? Because this is a threat actor that has also, I think, done some targeting of hospitality, targeting of airlines. Also a threat actor you should be aware of if you're someone who works at a telecom, certainly in the broader Middle East area. I think they've been active against governments as well. But this is not an IRGC affiliated actor. Can you tell us a little bit about Temp.Zagros and what we've seen of them recently?
Yeah, sure. So Zagros is probably, when we're talking about how prolific an Iranian and loud an Iranian group can get, even when they conduct merely collection or espionage operations. This would be Zagros. It's affiliated not with IRGC, like you said, but with MYS, the Ministry of Intelligence and Security, and this particular actor um, focuses almost exclusively on Middle Eastern countries. And basically, they're targeting, well, we believe it's anyone that they are able to in very extensive phishing campaigns, but we did see them target, in particular, organizations that might be in possession of PII. This includes telecoms, aviation, and hospitality. And so we believe they are very likely to be after anyone who possesses such sensitive data about individuals, specifically in Israel and other Middle Eastern countries, specifically Arab countries. Now, the thing about Zagros is they have, let's say, almost brought to perfection the strategy of living off the land, using almost exclusively disposable infrastructure, compromised email addresses, or publicly available implants. And they've been doing it in very extensive phishing operations, trying to get access to anyone that they could. They masquerade as the specific entities whose email they managed to compromise, and they disseminate phishing links or archives. And these links and archives are used to deliver a backdoor. Now, the thing is, when we discuss backdoors in terms of Zagros, we don't talk about the normal backdoor, the dedicated implant. We're talking about, most of the times, remote monitoring and management agents. These are agents that are legitimate and used by IT workers, to IT personnel, to control and deliver installations and to housekeep their networks. And Zagros have been delivering these implants with and whenever these RMMs, these legitimate agents, are delivered to a victim and the victim installs them, TEMP.Zagros gain access to that specific device. Over the last several years, I think it's already something like 4 years, we've seen Zagros abuse a very large list of these agents. This includes Screen Connect, Simple Help, Synchro MSP, Atera, Optitune, and more. And the thing is that even though these activities are continuously published and discussed in the security community, TEMP.Zagros continues using them, continues abusing the RMM agents, because it works. Because it works, it helps them masquerade the activity and makes it much more difficult for network defenders to detect, because EDRs can mistake that as a legitimate activity. If you're looking at communication from the device to the attacker infrastructure, what you see is a legitimate connection to a legitimate website.
And these are tools like TeamViewer or Screen Connect that, again, like as to your point, are being used often legitimately by a lot of these organizations already.
Exactly. Not only that, the Zagros also use the compromised email themselves to register to file hosting services, or to register the RMM agents themselves. So they avoid using their own email addresses, and instead they use compromised email addresses to support other operations. and it's just an endless chain of compromised email addresses that are being abused for various purposes.
I think it's another good example, again, not a new tactic, but another good example of how we are seeing, in the words of the M-Trends report from this year, just a greater focus on evasion of detection across the globe with many different types of threat actors. And, the usage of living off the land as a technique, something we've talked about on here before with respect to some of the Chinese threat groups such as Volt Typhoon. But I think it is worth hammering home. This is something we're seeing play out in many different forms from a variety of different threat actors, including some of these Iranian groups.
In parallel to these legitimate agents that we've discussed, Zagros still deploys dedicated implants. They don't do that very extensively, though it comes and goes in certain periods of time. For example, lately we did see them deploy some of these implants in several countries in the Middle East. Basically, what I think they're doing is using techniques across the board, very extensive infrastructure, very extensive phishing attempts, basically trying to gain access to as many entities as they can, both in the Middle East, Israel, and every country of interest.
So we've touched on three specific kind of groups of threat actors, and as always, there's more Iranian related APTs that historically we've tracked, as well as newer unks that are suspected, potentially as we start tracking them, of being tied to maybe a threat actor from Iran that we've seen in the past. I guess, here in kind of wrapping up and your outlook going forward, what are some of the things that we should be looking at? Not necessarily as a sign of maybe an escalation of Iranian threat activity, although that certainly could, include that. We've mostly talked about sort of the cyber espionage component here. But what are some things that you are watching for, that you are looking at going forward, that you think are kind of interesting with respect to Iranian threat activity? Could be espionage, could be cyber attack, some of the disruptive operations, but things that people should be paying attention for, things that you're looking at.
I think that the various types of operation that we've been observing over the last year, both will probably keep going, both the hack and leak operations and the espionage or collection operations. Now, in terms of how these operations look, that's the interesting aspect. I think that it would be it can become increasingly difficult to detect these operations because of the extensive reliance on public tooling, public infrastructure, or and specifically cloud infrastructure. What we've been observing in APT42 focusing on cloud data exfiltration, both Google, Microsoft, and Yahoo infrastructure. What we've been seeing with ANC 1549, abusing Azure infrastructure, using cloud infrastructure for C2. And what we've been seeing with Zagros leveraging publicly available legitimate agents, the remote monitoring and management. This is something that I think is becoming a trend and will only gain more volume as we move forward because it works. And because it's, let's say, it's not pricey in terms of infrastructure, in terms of resources, and it is much more immune to publications and to anyone trying to chase down the holy grail, the strategic implant. It doesn't exist in many cases. And I think this would be the trend moving forward, living of the land, using cloud infrastructure, as much as possible, publicly available tooling.
And I think that is interesting to think about, if we do see something, as we historically have from a variety of different Iranian threat groups, thinking back to, last several years, the attack against the Albanian government, things we've seen in the past, things like Shamoon, the attack on the casino in the United States many, many years ago. There's been the sort of willingness and tolerance to do these destructive cyber attacks. I do wonder how that changes things from a difficulty of attribution standpoint, which is obviously not a fast process in any such situation, but one in which now we're seeing more of this usage of living off the land techniques. If we see that coupled with a destructive cyber attack, again, as some of these more notable examples, how that will kind of complicate the attribution effort and make things kind of more difficult to respond to from a national kind of policy level. So I think that'll be something also interesting to watch if we do see that occur going forward.
Definitely, definitely. I do think that some of the trends maybe may make the actors harder to track, and some of them not necessarily. And it very much depends on how the actors will play in the future, and we're staying tuned.
Yeah. Well, I will make sure I include in the show notes some of the recent blogs that you and some of the others on your team have written. Some great resources around Iranian threat activity. But Afir, thanks once again for sharing your perspective here, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day.